Hello, we are officially at Module 5. Nonverbal communication. Okay, there's a lot to say about nonverbal communication, and for that reason, I made myself a list. So let's talk about this concept of immediacy. I didn't assign you an immediacy reading because my favorite Polar Springs are on sale at Tops, so I'm super pumped about that. I didn't provide you a reading about nonverbal immediacy because I thought you'd had enough, but I did provide you the nonverbal immediacy self-assessment, and you can just really call it immediacy because immediacy is nonverbal, right? It's the way that your nonverbal cues help to increase or decrease the perceived psychological distance between you and another person. So there's physical distance, there's emotional distance, right? There's relational blood kinship distance, and there's all kinds of distance. But immediacy distance is like sort of how transparent my being is to your being as indicated by immediacy behaviors. And it's a perception, it's not a fact. So like we talked about with the stuff in chapter 2, it's all about the degree to which your immediacy behaviors increase the perception of shorter distances or longer distances, not that you're actually, right? So if I stand with my arms crossed and I'm kind of far away from you, that doesn't mean that I am psychologically distant or distracted or not interested in connecting with you. It could mean a bunch of things, including that I'm cold, right? So it's a perception thing. So what that means is that when you're on the receiving end of immediacy behaviors, right? So if you are my student and you're trying to read my availability, emotional and psychological availability to you through my immediacy behaviors, you can't necessarily assume that certain behaviors that I'm using mean what you think they mean, right? So this could be because we're from different context cultures. I might be low context, you might be high context, and as a result, my immediacy behaviors might be different from yours. I may be doing something for a reason that you hadn't thought of before. Like I said, I'm very often cold. I also, this is going to sound so stupid, but I'm tall, and sometimes my arms get tired, like from hanging at my sides, and I don't want to put them on my hips like Wonder Woman, and I don't always have pockets, so a lot of times I'll do this. And it looks like, I'm being judgmental and standoffish, but in fact, it's just way more comfortable. So on the receiving end, you can't necessarily assume the things that you're assuming just because they've been your experience. So you have to be aware of that perception problem where you're kind of making assumptions based on immediacy behaviors. And this is where your perception checking can be helpful. So if you notice that a lot of times when you're in my office talking to me about something, my arms are crossed, you may not want to just say to me, hey, why are your arms crossed? Because that would be weird. But maybe down the road at some point, you could ask me, hey, I'm going in for a job interview. Do you think that I should, is it okay to stand with my arms crossed, right? That would be a way to get me to explain to you how I feel about that behavior without necessarily directly confronting me about it if that makes you uncomfortable. But this is that perception checking issue. You could also ask around and say, hey, do you notice when you're in Lee's office that her arms are crossed? And if a bunch of people are like, yeah, she tends to stand like that a lot, then you know, right, that it's probably not something that you need to take personally. But from my end, as the person sending those behaviors, it doesn't matter, right, that I'm just cold or my arms are tired from hanging at my sides. I'm still in charge of sending immediacy behaviors to you. And if this is causing problems, then it's my responsibility kind of not to do that. So two different ways to relate to that. All right. So we've talked about immediacy behaviors, and you can get a sense of your own strengths and weaknesses in terms of your immediacy using that immediacy self-report survey that I gave you. Keeping in mind that stuff is contextual, right? So for example, it's Western, I think it's a US model, and it for example thinks that lots of hand gestures and like closing physiological distance is considered a positive thing, but not necessarily, because sometimes like walking out into a crowd of people, if that's not normally, like if I'm teaching and I want to walk out into the audience, if that's unusual, it may be perceived as like violating a boundary. So you have to be careful because just because this model, I think, is a general rule of thumb for US-based Western interactions, and not even Western, but just like cultures that tend to value higher immediacy behaviors, doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be benefited. It's also gendered and raced. Frankly, if you're a white, cis, straight male and you want to increase your hand gestures, that's probably going to be a net positive for you. If I'm hand gesturing it up, that's going to gender me, right? Because I'm a woman. So I have to be careful that I don't have necessarily the same luxury of using my hand gestures as someone in a different position. So again, it's a model. It's helpful. I think it's a useful way to think about what you do. But I'm not going to say that if you just follow its advice, you're suddenly going to have some kind of like massive uptick in communication results. Because again, it is gendered, it's raced, it's cultured, etc. All right. I would like to dispel the myth right here, right now, that nonverbals are something that a person can read to figure out if someone is lying to you. So a lot of times when students take this class, they want to like learn about, well, what if I'm looking up and to the left? Or what if I'm not making a lot of eye contact or whatever, right? What if I have my arms crossed? What if I'm, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's all this stuff. There's nothing that indicates that someone is more or less likely to lie. It just isn't true. I mean, there's studies out there. There's a really famous study that like had people who were lying about something tell the lie when they had to pee and tell the lie when they didn't have to pee, and then said that like if you have to pee, you're a better liar. I mean, this is bad science, okay? So get rid of this idea that certain nonverbal behaviors can be detected. That said, there are nonverbal behaviors that if you need to deceive somebody, you can learn things that are more likely to increase perceptions of truthfulness. I'm not going to teach them to you. I just don't think this is a productive move. But there is some really cool stuff on nonverbals. I just don't think it has to do with lie detection. As human beings, we just have this craving to be able to guarantee that what people are saying is true. And the guarantee isn't there. So I'm not going to bother wasting everyone's time pretending like it is. Now, there is some mix. So I don't know if you saw the Amy Cuddy, how your body language can kind of empower you. And she talks about how like larger body language can help people take up more space. And this has been a big theme lately, right? There's like that book by the CEO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In. And this idea that when you lean toward people, it makes you more engaged. Same thing when you kind of make yourself bigger and you stand up tall, you tend to feel more empowered. You tend to be more intimidating. There's mixed results on that stuff. But if you want to watch Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, I think that can be, especially if you tend to be a person who feels a little bit marginalized or who has trouble kind of, feeling empowered or feeling like you're entitled to take up space. I don't have that problem. But if you did, that might be something that you could see if it works for you. But again, mixed reviews on whether that stuff even matters. But again, just because you can't intend to use nonverbals in a certain way to get a certain outcome doesn't mean that using nonverbals doesn't have an outcome. For example, there is no guarantee that if you go out to dinner with a business associate and you subtly push your napkin and plate and fork over to their side until you're taking up more than 50% of the table, that's going to mean you're going to win the business transaction, right? So if I'm trying to, I don't know, if I am going out, I would never do this, but if I'm going out to lunch with a business associate and we're negotiating some contract and I want 5% and they want 10% and I subtly, as I'm kind of like pushing my stuff over to their side till there's more on their end, then I may get my request and they may lose. But not necessarily, even though there have been studies that say when you watch a business transaction, usually you can predict the winner of the transaction based on how much their stuff is pushed over. But here's the problem. The same study shows that when people try to do that on purpose, it feels encroaching. So it's only when the negotiation was always kind of going in your favor, and so then either as a cause or a result or some other nebulous factor, you were pushing your way over to the other person, that you received the benefit. It wasn't something you did on purpose. Likewise, it could just be that like taller people with longer limbs tend to make more money, which people have always known that taller people tend to be favored in certain societies. So maybe you just take up more space at a table, and the relationship between how much space you take up and who wins the business contract have in fact nothing to do with your nonverbal signals. So all that is to say that the nonverbal signals just cannot predict the outcome. But there are certain things that you should understand about your nonverbal behaviors to kind of control for how you want to be perceived by other people. But there's no guarantee that that's going to work. So when we talk about nonverbals, we tend to spend a lot of time talking about the channels like body language, gestures, tone of voice. Right? We talk about these things as if they're the most important nonverbal signals. But in fact, A lot of nonverbal has to do with what we call paralanguage, which is how your voice modulates language aside from the content that you're expressing. So that can be upward pitch, if your voice goes up or down at the end of a sentence. Vocal fry, which is when you talk like this, is part of paralanguage. So there's a bunch of factors. I won't get into them here because I've tried before and it's just too much like a public speaking class. But paralanguage is so important. And paralanguage you can control. So there have been a lot of very decisive studies about how higher range voices, especially nasally voices, tend to be perceived as less intelligent, less pleasant. So if you tend to have a higher nasal voice, which you'd only know if you ask someone or if you heard yourself, if you tend to drop your voice down a little bit, that can really help. So I don't know. What do you think? Does this feel more? Are you like enjoying this conversation more? Do I feel calm and pleasing, or do you prefer when I kind of talk in my higher, more nasally register? Also, when you talk fast and your voice gets higher and you're sort of nasally, you can talk a lot faster. But when you want your voice to be sort of lower, you have to slow down. And so people tend to perceive slower speakers, not super slow, but slower speakers, as more competent and rational and relaxing as people who tend to talk really fast and get really excited. So these are all things you can learn about in a vocalics class or a public speaking class. We won't get into them here, but I just want to point out that when we talk about channels and proxemics and chronemics, yes, those things are important, but we're sort of ignoring a whole component to nonverbal communication, which is your paralanguage, or the way that your voice produces sound to make words. And the last thing I'll say is that the other thing that we're totally ignoring when we talk about nonverbals is the form of language. And this is why understanding how to write, how to speak, style, rhetorical forms, sentence structure is important because, for example, there is classic advice to generally avoid writing in the passive voice. So instead of writing, the ball was thrown at me, you say, they threw the ball. And that's not always true because passive voice can be very powerful if you're trying to evoke a sense of victimage, right? So instead of he hit her, which would be more focused, or she hit him, which would be more focused on the perpetrator of the crime, as opposed to he was hit by her, which is more about creating a sense of victimage for the person hit, right? So they're two different foci, even though they're technically communicating the same meaning. So if you're trying to make the victim piece of the story the highlight, then passive voice is strategic in that case. But if you're just using passive voice because you don't know how to write an active voice, what you're doing is you're just constantly sounding like you're not in control of information. So this is, again, another huge component of nonverbal language that we don't tend to focus on, even though it is very, very important. And that is sort of the form of language, right? The rhetorical form. So even though in this class we're going to focus on your channels, proxemics, chronemics, etc., don't forget that there are two other components to nonverbal communication that are very important that you need to learn how to control for as best you can. And those are paralanguage and what we're calling rhetorical form, right? How ideas are expressed through sentence and clause structure, paragraph structure, right? Whatever. All right. Okay. So then the last thing to talk about are the four components of nonverbal communication and their relationship. All right. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm actually going to make a second short video about that, just because I've been talking now for, 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'll come back with another short video on the four components of nonverbal communication and their relationship.